The air in the headquarters had a specific, institutional quality, a scent composed of old paper, floor wax, and the faint, metallic tang of anxiety. It was 1978. The long, grim tapestry of the Cold War was stretched taut, every thread a potential tripwire for annihilation. In one of its many anonymous rooms, a room lit by the greenish glow of a desk lamp and the pale gray light of a London morning filtering through slatted blinds, a man named Arthur Pendleton began his day as he always did, with routine. A veteran of the service, his face was a roadmap of past conflicts, his eyes the color of a winter sky. He was a sifter of secrets, a man who understood that the truth was rarely a whole cloth, but rather, a collection of disparate threads. His desk was a landscape of orderly piles, each folder a contained universe of potential and peril. It was this ingrained order, this sanctity of the known process, that made the anomaly so immediately, violently apparent. Nestled between a buff-colored file from the Berlin desk and a blue-banded report from Signals Intelligence was a simple, cream-colored envelope. It was unmarked. No typed address, no departmental stamp, no red slashes denoting classification. It was just there, like a ghost at a banquet. Pendleton's hand, which had been reaching for his tea, froze midair. His brow furrowed. He was a man of precise channels. Information did not simply materialize. It was logged, routed, signed for, and chained. This object violated the fundamental physics of his world. He picked it up. It was light, containing perhaps a single sheet. He turned it over. No seal, no watermark, no trace of its journey. It was as if it had been conjured from the very atoms of the air. He used a letter opener, a slender, silver dagger his daughter had given him, its handle worn smooth. The slice was clean. Inside, as suspected, was a single sheet of plain, high-quality bond paper. The message, typed on what he recognized as a Swiss-made Hermes typewriter, the E, had a slight, characteristic tilt, was stark in its simplicity. Just 2 lines. Objective confirmed. Phase 1 complete. Beneath it, a single, typed code phrase, Iron Lantern. He read it again. And a third time. His mind, a well-indexed library of active operations, cross-referenced projects, and codenames, came up empty. Iron Lantern. It rang no bells, triggered no associations. It was a null set. There was no joy in this mystery, only a cold, creeping dread. An operation, it stated, was not just planned, but already in motion. And it had achieved its first, critical milestone. But whose operation? Approved by whom? Funded by what hidden budget? He activated the intercom on his desk, his voice deceptively calm. Simmons, a moment, if you please. A younger man, sharp-faced and eager, appeared at the door. Sir. This, Pendleton said, holding up the envelope between 2 fingers as if it were a contaminated specimen. Where did it come from? Simmons blinked. I'm not sure, sir. It was on the incoming tray with the morning courier batch. There is no log for it. No signature. No point of origin. Pendleton's tone was flat, forensic. Check with registry. Check with the front desk. Check with the night watch. I want to know the hands it passed through. All of them. An hour later, the report was as empty as the envelope had been full of implication. The night watchman had seen nothing. The courier service had no record of an unscheduled delivery. Registry was adamant. No such item had been processed through their meticulous system. The internal mailroom was a dead end. Fingerprint analysis, rushed through as a priority, yielded nothing but a few smudges and one of Pendleton's own partials. It was clean. Professionally, terrifyingly clean. Someone, or some group, had the access, the skill, and the audacity to place a message directly onto the desk of a senior intelligence officer, bypassing every layer of security designed to prevent exactly that. They had launched a mission without a charter, a ghost ship sailing under a black flag. And whatever Iron Lantern was, its first phase was already in the history books. The war in the shadows had just spawned a new, unknown faction, and its first communique was now burning a hole in Arthur Pendleton's mind. The game was afoot, but he didn't know the rules, the players, or even the goal. All he had was a name, and the chilling certainty that something monumental had just begun. If Phase 1 was the recruitment of a Soviet insider, then the architects of Iron Lantern had not just thought outside the box. They had discarded the box entirely and chosen a shadow from within the fortress walls. The KGB's counterintelligence apparatus, the mighty Third Chief Directorate, was a masterpiece of paranoid design. Its eyes were trained on the usual suspects, the diplomats with their access to Western embassies, the military officers who traveled abroad, the scientists who attended international conferences, the journalists who filed reports from foreign capitals. These were the people with connections, with temptations, with vulnerabilities that could be exploited. They never looked twice at Anatoly Vasiliev. To the system, Anatoly was not a person, he was a function. A piece of bureaucratic furniture. He was a file archivist, grade 4, in the Central Archives of the Ministry of Defense, a monolithic, soulless building on the outskirts of Moscow, a place where concrete seemed to weep in the perpetual damp. He was 53 years old, a man whose life had been shaped by the twin forces of silence and obedience. His face was unremarkable, his posture slightly stooped from a lifetime of leaning over files, his suits always a shade of gray that seemed to absorb the light. He was a widower, his wife, Larissa, taken by a swift and brutal cancer 5 years prior. His son, a bright-eyed boy who had loved mathematics, was buried in the frozen ground of Afghanistan, another name on a long, secret list of casualties from a war the state was reluctant to acknowledge. Anatoly's world had shrunk to the four walls of his apartment in a crumbling pre-war block in the vast, echoing caverns of the archive. His colleagues were men much like himself, quiet, defeated, their ambitions worn down by the sheer, crushing weight of the system. They clocked in at 8, clocked out at 5, and in between, they moved through the labyrinthine shelves with the quiet efficiency of monks in a library of the dead. They fetched and they returned. They were the guardians of secrets, yet they were deemed too insignificant to understand them. This perception was their greatest armor, and Iron Lantern's sharpest weapon. Anatoly's recruitment had not been a dramatic affair. There had been no late-night meeting in a Gorky park thick with fog, no furtive handshake in a metro station, no envelope thick with American dollars. It had been a slow, patient cultivation, a masterpiece of psychological warfare waged on a single, broken heart. It began with a book. A rare, first-edition volume of poetry by Anna Akhmatova, a poet whose work was banned, whose voice spoke of a Russia that existed before the steel and the concrete and the fear. It had been left on a bench he frequented during his lunch hour, a bench overlooking a scabrous patch of grass that pretended to be a park. There was no note, just the book. He had taken it home, his heart hammering against his ribs, and read it by the weak light of a single bulb, the words a balm on a soul he thought had long since cauterized. It was a message. Someone knew him. Not the functionary, but the man. The man who had once read poetry to his wife, the man who had dreamed of a different life. Weeks later, a small, exquisitely carved wooden bird, a snagir or bullfinch, appeared on the same bench. It was the same kind of carving his son had tried his hand at as a boy, clumsy and full of love. The message was clear, and devastating. They knew his grief. They knew the hollowed-out spaces inside him. The next time, there was a typed note, left in the same spot. It was not a demand. It was an offer. A conversation. The handler, when contact was finally made, was not a brash American. He was a European, a man who spoke Russian with the soft, cultured accent of an old St. Petersburg academic. He called himself Mikhail, though Anatoly knew it was as false as the name he himself was given, Ivan. Their meetings were sparse, safe, and utterly deniable. A shared table in a vast, noisy cafeteria. A chance encounter on a crowded bus. A nod across a museum hall. The conversations were never about documents, not at first. They were about poetry. About music. About the soul of a nation that was being suffocated by its own protectors. They offered him no money. They offered him something far more valuable, understanding. They offered him a way to honor the memory of his wife and son, not through grand, heroic gestures, but through a quiet, sustained act of defiance against the machine that had made their lives, and their deaths, so small and meaningless. And so, Anatoly Vasiliev became the asset the Soviets never detected. His method was his genius. He did not take photographs. The click of a shutter, the whir of a film advance, these were sounds that would scream betrayal in the tomb-like silence of the archives. He did not steal papers. The absence of a single document would trigger an audit, a panic, a hunt that would inevitably lead back to him. He did not meet handlers in shadowy alleys, transferring microfilm in a sweaty palm. He became a librarian of memory. He would request a file, one of the thousands that passed through his hands each year. He would sit at his wooden desk, its surface grooved and stained by generations of anonymous clerks, and he would read. But he was not reading for content, not in the way an analyst would. He was a savant of context. He would memorize a fragment. 2 numbers from a logistics report about missile fuel shipments to a base in Plesetsk. A single date, out of sequence, scribbled in the margin of a Politburo meeting summary. Half a paragraph from an engineering assessment of a new submarine's acoustic signature. A name, misspelled, on a distribution list for a scientific paper on radar-absorbent materials. Individually, these pieces were meaningless. They were the digital snow of a vast, secret broadcast. But Anatoly, with his archivist's mind, could hold them. He would return to his small, silent apartment, and he would transcribe these fragments onto cheap schoolchildren's notepaper, using a code of his own devising, a simple cipher based on a page number from his beloved Akhmatova. The notes themselves were then burned, the ashes stirred into his morning tea. The information lived only in his mind, a hidden constellation of data points. Weeks, sometimes months later, during a chance meeting with Mikhail on a park bench, or in the queue for bread, he would speak. He would not talk of missiles or submarines. He would mention the numbers, as if recalling a football score. He would reference the date, as if remembering a relative's birthday. He would paraphrase the half-paragraph, as if discussing a novel he'd read. It was all done in the open, a performance of mundane chatter that was, in reality, one of the most sophisticated intelligence operations of the Cold War. Over the course of 2 years, these fragments, these scattered pixels of information, were transmitted. They traveled through dead drops and brush passes, across borders in the diplomatic pouches of neutral nations, into the hands of analysts in Langley and London who were initially baffled by the stream of seemingly disconnected data. But as the pieces were assembled, cross-referenced, and fed into nascent computer systems, a picture began to emerge from the noise. It was not a picture of a single weapon, or a single plan. It was a terrifying, panoramic view of the entire Soviet strategic machine. It revealed vulnerabilities in their early warning systems, bottlenecks in their production lines, the true, often exaggerated, state of their technological prowess, and the deep, structural paranoia that governed their military doctrine. Anatoly Vasiliev, the invisible man, the background noise, was holding up a mirror to the Soviet bear, and the reflection he provided was more detailed, more intimate, and more damning than any satellite photo or intercepted communique could ever be. He was Iron Lantern's flame, burning bright and steady in the heart of the darkness, illuminating truths that his masters believed were forever hidden in the shadows. And they never knew he was there. The fragments, in their isolation, were like single notes from a symphony played in a distant room. A metallurgical report from a closed city in the Urals, mentioning an alloy with a bizarrely high tolerance for thermal stress. A requisition form for a volume of a rare earth element, promethium, so large it could only be for a project of staggering scale. A personnel transfer order, moving a dozen of the Soviet Union's top hydrodynamicists and acousticians from their prestigious institutes to a remote, landlocked facility on the shores of a lake in Siberia. A security memo, complaining about the architectural peculiarities of a new building at a radar site, specifying walls that were not just lead-lined, but curved in a specific, non-functional parabolic shape. To the analysts in the West, these were data points in a void. They were anomalies, curiosities filed away in the great, groaning cabinets of the Cold War. But to the mind that had collected them, the mind of Anatoly Vasiliev, they were connected by an invisible thread. He didn't understand the science, not in any formal sense. His was a literary mind, a mind of patterns and narratives. And the narrative he saw emerging from these disparate files was one of profound, directed purpose. It was the literary equivalent of finding the same strange, made-up word in a dozen different, otherwise unrelated, books. The breakthrough came on a Tuesday. The Moscow autumn was turning the city to gold and grit, the wind whipping dried leaves against the grimy windows of the archive. Anatoly was processing a batch of decommissioned files from a department so secret its designation was a single letter, O. The Otdel, or department. It was a known ghost, a budgetary black hole that the KGB's own auditors were rumored to view with superstitious dread. The files were mundane on the surface: utility bills, canteen meal vouchers, maintenance requests for air filtration systems. But buried within a routine internal audit of the department's printing supplies was a single, startling line. It was a footnote, a justification for an order of a specialized, ultra-dense paper stock. The reason given, almost as an afterthought, was, for documentation of the Zolotoy SHCHIT project. Zolotoy SHCHIT. Golden Shield. The name meant nothing, but it was a name. It was a handle. And a few weeks later, he found another. It was on a travel authorization form, buried in a stack of hundreds. A scientist, a man named Dr. Yevgeny Kovalchuk, a theoretical physicist whose published work was on benign topics like cosmic background radiation, was being granted expedited transport to a location identified only by a 4-digit code 7431. The purpose of the visit was listed as final consultative review of Zolotoy SHCHIT operational parameters. And then, the line that made Anatoly's blood, which usually flowed with the slow, cold pace of a deep river, turned to ice in his veins. Operational readiness expected within 120 days. He committed it all to memory. The name, the code, the date, the phrase. He did not tremble. He did not sweat. The decades of enforced emotional control, the mask of the bland, unthinking bureaucrat, served him now as the perfect camouflage for espionage. He finished his shift, his movements as measured and precise as ever. He walked home through the gathering dusk, the words echoing in his mind like a death knell. Operational readiness. This was not a research project. This was a weapon. and its shield was soon to be raised. The mechanism for passing this information was a thing of beauty in its absurd simplicity. It was a system designed not for speed, but for absolute deniability, a chain of custody that was intentionally broken, its links scattered and anonymous. Anatoly's handler, Mikhail, was the first, fragile link. The information was passed during a visit to the Tretyakov Gallery. They stood, two middle-aged men in shabby coats, before a vast, dark painting of a historical battle. Anatoly, his eyes on the swirling, violent canvas, spoke softly, his words barely a whisper, about a golden shield he had read about in a novel, and how the hero had 120 days to prepare for the final siege. Mikhail, his hands clasped behind his back, gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. The information had changed hands. The next link was Professor Alistair Finch, a mathematician from the University of Cambridge. He was a tall, reedy man with a shock of white hair and a mind that lived in the rarefied air of non-Euclidean geometry. He was also, in the parlance of the trade, a useful idiot. He was not an agent. He was not a sympathizer. He was a purist, a man who believed in the free and open exchange of knowledge, a champion of scientific détente. He attended conferences in neutral cities like Vienna and Geneva, where he would meet with his Soviet counterparts, sharing pre-print papers and engaging in fierce, friendly debates. Unbeknownst to Professor Finch, the papers he carried were subtly altered. The process was handled by a quiet, unassuming technician in a basement room of the service's technical division. Using precise, photolithographic techniques, the title page of one of Finch's own dense, theoretical papers would be replaced. The new title page was identical in every way, save for a few nearly microscopic annotations. A period might be slightly raised above the line. The serif on a single letter, T, might be fractionally longer. The spacing between two words in the abstract might be a hair's breadth wider. To anyone else, it was a simple printing imperfection. To a trained analyst with the correct key, it was a coded message, a string of numbers and letters conveying the essence of Anatoly's discovery. Zolotoy shchit. 7431. 120 days. The KGB's counterintelligence teams, the watchdogs of the Soviet scientific elite, were vigilant. They scanned for hidden film, for coded phrases in letters, for surreptitious signals. They would meticulously examine the briefcases of men like Professor Finch, looking for false bottoms and hidden compartments. They would listen to his conversations for verbal codes. But they never, ever, thought to scrutinize the typography of an academic paper on hyperbolic manifolds. It was a method that exploited the Soviets' own bureaucratic literalism and their profound suspicion of overt contact. They were looking for a secret message. They never considered that the message was hiding in plain sight, masquerading as a typesetter's error. The system was so subtle, so brilliantly mundane, that it was effectively invisible. When the decoded message from Professor Finch's paper landed on Arthur Pendleton's desk, it was the final, terrifying piece of the Iron Lantern puzzle. The disparate fragments that Anatoly had been providing for months suddenly coalesced. The strange alloys, the massive promethium orders, the relocated scientists, the parabolic walls, they were all facets of this golden shield. And it was on the brink of activation. A crisis of this magnitude would normally trigger a whirlwind of official activity. A top-level task force would be convened, codenamed and budgeted. Case officers would be dispatched. Signals would fly across secure channels between London, Washington, and Langley. The machinery of state would lurch into motion, a beast of steel and wire and fear. But Pendleton, a man who had spent his life inside that machinery, knew with a cold, certain dread that this was the one thing they could not do. To formally launch an operation against Zolotoy shchit would be to sign its death warrant, and possibly their own. The Soviet security apparatus was a hypersensitive organism, its antennae tuned to the slightest tremor in the political ether. A sudden flurry of encoded traffic, the sudden, unexplained travel of known intelligence officers, the creation of a new, high-priority budget line, these were the very signals the KGB's watchdogs were trained to detect. It would be like shouting in a library. The Soviets would know they had been compromised. They would scrub the project, bury it deeper, and launch a vicious, internal mole hunt that would almost certainly find its way back to Anatoly. The flame of the Iron Lantern would be snuffed out. So, they did the unprecedented, the illogical. They chose not to act. Officially, that is. Pendleton initiated what he would later, in the strictest confidence, call the quiet. There would be no task force. No case officers assigned. No official funding requisitions. No paperwork of any kind. Not a single memo, not a file folder, not a carbon copy. If the USSR ever discovered anything, there would be nothing to point to, no organizational chart to interrogate, no audit trail to follow. Instead, in the hushed twilight of a private club in St. James's, over glasses of single malt whiskey that caught the light like amber, Pendleton met with three people. There was Evelyn Shaw, a sharp, intuitive analyst from the Soviet science desk, a woman who could read a technical schematic like a novel. There was Malcolm Reynolds, a field operative so deep cover his own service sometimes lost track of him, a man who moved through the world like a ghost, his identity a collection of layered falsehoods. And there was Dr. R.S. Thorne, a physicist from Imperial College, a consultant so brilliant and so discreet he was trusted with the crown jewels of Western secrets. This was the entirety of the Iron Lantern operational team. Their mandate was simple: understand and neutralize the Golden Shield threat using only the tools they already had, the travel already scheduled, the contacts already in place. They would be a phantom cell, operating in the blind spots of both their own bureaucracy and that of the enemy. Evelyn Shaw began her work from her own official desk, using her authorized access to cross-reference Anatoly's fragments with every piece of scientific intelligence the West had ever gathered. She looked for patterns in seismic readings, in atmospheric radiation samples, in the faint, electronic whispers intercepted by listening posts in Turkey and Norway. Malcolm Reynolds used a pre-planned, legitimate, trip to Helsinki for a trade conference as cover. From there, using a network of cutouts and dead drops that existed for other, now dormant operations, he began to make gentle, imperceptible contact with the edges of the Soviet scientific diaspora, asking vague questions about colleagues who had disappeared into the motherland. Dr. Thorne, scheduled to give a lecture at CERN in Switzerland, used the international, collaborative environment to engage in seemingly innocent conversations with a Hungarian physicist who was known to have ties to the Soviet Academy of Sciences. The conversations were about theoretical physics, about energy shields and directed plasma, topics straight from the pages of science fiction, discussed with the amused, academic detachment of men playing with ideas. They worked in silence and in shadow, a conspiracy of four, their only record the growing understanding in their own minds. They were walking a tightrope without a net, over an abyss that threatened to swallow them all. The fate of the world now depended not on the might of armies or the power of governments, but on the nerve, ingenuity, and utter deniability of a handful of people who, officially, were doing nothing at all. The confirmation of Anatoly's intelligence was the next, impossible step. The quiet committee, Pendleton, Shaw, Reynolds, and Thorne, now understood the broad, terrifying strokes of the Zolotoy SHCHIT. It was a radical, and if the fragments were to be believed, a viable, strategic defense system. A network of ground-based emitters and orbital platforms designed to project a concentrated field of ionized plasma, a shimmering, energetic shield that could, in theory, disable incoming ballistic missiles by overloading their delicate guidance systems and frying their internal electronics. It was a sword and shield in one, a weapon that violated a dozen treaties and promised to shatter the fragile balance of mutually assured destruction. The Soviets would be untouchable. The doomsday clock wouldn't just tick to midnight, it would be smashed altogether. But fragments from a grieving archivist, no matter how brilliant, were not enough. They needed a primary source. A blueprint. A schematic. A single, definitive document that would confirm the project's existence, its scope, and, most critically, its Achilles heel. The target was the Central Archive's Special Materials Vault, a sub-basement level known colloquially among the few who knew of it as the tomb. It was where the Otdel stored its most sensitive physical records, the raw engineering data that was too volatile to be trusted to any digital system. Getting a Western operative inside was a fantasy, a suicide mission of the highest order. The vault was protected by a layered defense system that was the stuff of legend: pressure-sensitive floors, biometric locks keyed to a handful of authorized personnel, a continuous air sampling system that could detect the faintest chemical signature of an intruder, and a permanent detachment of KGB guards who were rumored to be chosen for their lack of family and their absolute, unquestioning loyalty. Malcolm Reynolds, studying the stolen architectural plans under the dim light of a safe house in a nondescript Brussels suburb, didn't see an impenetrable fortress. He saw a system. And like any system, it was a web of dependencies, routines, and, most importantly, people. His plan was not to breach the vault. It was to persuade the vault to betray itself. The operation was a symphony of psychological manipulation, a concerto of controlled chaos played upon the brittle instrument of Soviet bureaucracy. It began not in Moscow, but in a print shop in East Berlin, where a dissident with a grudge and a master forger's hand, operating under a false flag, produced a batch of near-perfect counterfeit delivery orders. These weren't for the archive itself, but for its support network. A truck carrying specialized acid-free paper for document preservation was rerouted to a different ministry entirely, its driver confused but obedient to the impeccably forged paperwork he carried. A scheduled maintenance visit for the vault's climate control system was abruptly cancelled, then reinstated, then cancelled again, thanks to a series of conflicting memos that originated from a corrupted internal mail roster, a roster Reynolds had accessed through a black bag job on a mid-level administrator's mistress's apartment, where he'd planted a seemingly innocent birthday gift that contained a rudimentary wiretap. Each action was a single, subtle nudge. A delivery of critical calibration equipment for the archive's microfilm readers was, accidentally, sent to a meteorological station in Vladivostok, the shipping labels swapped during a routine loading bay inspection. The internal phone logs for the archive's administrative office were subtly altered by a listening post in Finland, which had tapped the main trunk line. The changes were minor. A call that lasted 10 minutes was logged as lasting 2. A call that was never made appeared as a brief, frustrating connection to a disconnected number. The effect was a growing sense of unease, a creeping institutional dementia. The goal was not to cause a breakdown, but to foster a very specific, very Soviet brand of paranoia, the fear of internal incompetence. The fingerprints were all pointed inward. A delivery driver was blamed for his own illiteracy. A clerk was reprimanded for poor record keeping. A maintenance supervisor was suspected of drunkenness. The system, trained to see enemies everywhere, began to see them in the mirror. The chaos culminated in a single, perfect storm of bureaucratic confusion. A fire drill, scheduled for a Tuesday, was mysteriously moved to a Thursday based on a forged directive from the Moscow Fire Brigade. On that Thursday, as the blaring alarms sent clerks and junior staff streaming into the courtyard, a separate, equally forged work order authorized a priority sanitation detail for the special materials vault anteroom, citing a non-existent leak from a pipe that had supposedly damaged several file cartons. The microfilm was the Rosetta Stone. In the secure, soundproofed basement of a Georgian townhouse in London, a world away from the paranoid silence of the Moscow archive, Dr. Aris Thorne and Evelyn Shaw pieced together the terrifying reality of Zolotoy Shchit. The ghostly images, projected onto a large whiteboard, revealed not just a weapon, but a complete architectural philosophy for a new kind of warfare. The schematics showed massive, parabolic emitter arrays buried in the Siberian permafrost and mounted on secret, heavy-lift orbital platforms. The technical data described a process for creating a sustained, high-energy plasma field by exciting a proprietary mixture of gases using precisely tuned microwave emissions. The math was breathtaking, a brutalist poetry of force and control. But Thorne, his eyes scanning the complex formulae and stress test results, saw something else. He saw the seams. "It's a house of cards," he murmured, his finger tracing a cascade of equations. "A brilliant one, but a house of cards nonetheless. The entire system relies on a perfect harmonic resonance between the ground and orbital emitters. The timing has to be picosecond perfect. The plasma mixture has to be isotopically pure. If the resonance is disrupted, even slightly, the field becomes unstable. It would collapse, or worse. The feedback could cascade back through the emitters themselves. This was the vulnerability. Not a physical weak point to be bombed, but a conceptual one to be exploited. A seed of doubt to be planted in the mind of the project itself. The dismantling of Zolotoy Shchit was not an act of sabotage, but one of subtle poisoning. It was death by 1,000 bureaucratic paper cuts, each one delivered with the flawless, invisible precision that had come to define Iron Lantern. It began with the supply chain. A clerk at a rare earth processing plant in Kazakhstan, a man whose loyalty had been secured years earlier for an unrelated, long-forgotten operation, received a subtly altered purchase order. The specification for the promethium isotope required for the plasma catalyst was changed, ever so slightly, from promethium-147 to the far more common, and subtly different, promethium-146. The resulting shipment passed all initial purity checks, but its nuclear signature was just enough off-spec to introduce a latent instability in the field matrix. The error was logged as a simple supplier oversight. Next, the design teams. A package of academic journals, mailed to a closed city in the Urals, contained a seemingly legitimate pre-print paper from a Japanese research institute. The paper, a masterful forgery created by Thorne and secretly substituted for the real one in the international mail stream, proposed a minor refinement to plasma containment theory. It was dense, brilliant, and just plausible enough to be compelling. It suggested that a specific, counterintuitive adjustment to the emitter array's focal length would yield a 5% increase in field cohesion. A junior, ambitious Soviet physicist, eager to make his mark, incorporated the change into his next set of calculations. This created a fundamental conflict with the original specifications being used by a rival design bureau in Leningrad, a rivalry that was already fraught with professional jealousy. The two teams, each convinced of their own correctness, spent weeks arguing over the conflicting data, each blaming the other for the error. The project's timeline began to stretch. Then, the testing phase. The Zolotoy SHCHIT prototype required a new type of ultra-high-frequency oscilloscope to verify the timing of the emitter pulses. Through a Byzantine chain of front companies and false flag procurement orders, Malcolm Reynolds's network ensured that the two oscilloscopes delivered to the main test facility in Siberia had serial numbers that were one digit apart, suggesting they were from the same production batch. In reality, they were from different manufacturers, with minutely different internal calibrations. The readings they produced during the first integrated systems test were irreconcilable. One showed the resonance was perfect, the other showed a dangerous phase variance. The engineers on site, trusting their equipment, assumed the problem was in the emitters themselves. They tore apart and reassembled the primary array 3 times, finding nothing. They blamed shoddy Soviet workmanship. Finally, the field reports. As the project descended into chaos, the on-site commanders and political officers began filing their assessments. These reports, meant for the eyes of the Politburo only, were the most sensitive documents of all. And it was here that Anatoly Vasiliev played his final, crucial role. He did not need to steal them. He simply had to observe their distribution. He noted the names of the officials who received the increasingly pessimistic reports. Then, through Mikhail, this list was passed to the Quiet Committee. Using this intelligence, Reynolds's network performed its most audacious act. They identified the most paranoid, the most ideologically rigid of these officials, a hardliner named Comrade General Volkov. Through a fake letter, typed on stolen Ministry of Defense stationery and placed in his internal mail pile, they fed his paranoia. The letter, purportedly from a concerned patriot within the KGB, suggested that the failures of Zolotoy SHCHIT were not due to incompetence, but to deliberate wrecking by a faction of scientists with cosmopolitan, a code for Jewish backgrounds who were secretly loyal to Western ideals. It cited the obvious design flaws and the suspicious equipment failures as evidence. It was the final, masterful stroke. Volkov, a man whose mind was a petri dish for conspiracy theories, needed no further convincing. He took the forged letter and the mountain of now contradictory data from the failed tests and built an airtight case for the prosecution. He stood before the Politburo subcommittee and did not argue that the project was too expensive or too ambitious. He argued that it was compromised from within, that it was a nest of traitors and saboteurs. The effect was terminal. The Zolotoy SHCHIT project, once the Soviet Union's great hope for strategic dominance, was abruptly and completely shut down. The scientists were dispersed, some to gulags, others to obscure teaching posts. The facilities were mothballed. The vast budgets were reallocated. The official post-mortem, written by Volkov himself, concluded, the project was doomed by internal inefficiency, technical overreach, and a lack of revolutionary vigilance among the scientific cadres. The words, foreign intelligence, never appeared. Why would they? All the evidence, every single fingerprint, pointed directly back at the Soviets' own systemic failures, their own bureaucratic infighting, their own deeply ingrained culture of suspicion. Years later, in the early 1990s, the Soviet Union was a memory. Its archives were cracked open, and former officers, now adrift in a new Russia, sifted through the wreckage of their former empire, trying to understand what had gone wrong. A group of them, including a retired general from the KGB's Science and Technology Directorate, convened an informal review of the great, failed projects. When they came to the file for Zolotoy SHCHIT, they shook their heads in bitter recognition. It was a perfect case study, they agreed, of the Soviet system's fatal flaws. The paperwork was all there. The conflicting reports, the botched shipments, the ideological infighting, the damning internal assessment by Comrade General Volkov. No foreign intelligence involvement was ever detected. The general read aloud from the final summary, his voice a dry rasp. The collapse was entirely organic. He closed the file with a definitive thud. The others nodded in grim agreement. They were not wrong in their facts, they were simply, utterly, blind to the truth that lay between the lines. For the truth was that Iron Lantern was an operation that existed only in the spaces where official record-keeping did not. It lived in the memory of Arthur Pendleton, who took the secret with him to his grave in a quiet English churchyard. It lived in the mind of Evelyn Shaw, who never wrote a report on it, but who saw its lessons in every subsequent intelligence analysis she conducted. It lived with Dr. R.S. Thorne, who would sometimes look up at the night sky and know, with a physicist's certainty, that a particular shimmer was just the aurora borealis, and not something else. It lived with Malcolm Reynolds, who simply vanished one day, his name a ghost in the personnel records of an agency that could not officially acknowledge his existence. And it lived, most poignantly, with Anatoly Vasiliev. He never knew the full impact of what he had done. He continued his work in the archives, a gray man in a gray world, until the day he quietly retired. He died in his sleep in 1991, the same year the country he had so quietly undermined ceased to exist. On his bedside table was a worn, first edition book of poetry by Anna Akhmatova. There was no funeral, no state recognition. He was as invisible in death as he had been in life. No agent was ever caught. No document was ever traced. No operative was ever exposed. No Soviet counterintelligence report ever so much as whispered its name. Iron Lantern was a spark in the darkness, a flame that burned so cleanly and so silently that it left no smoke, no heat signature, and no ash. It was a secret not just from the enemy, but from history itself, a perfect, self-erasing testament to the power of an idea carried in the minds of a few, and never, ever written down.